first to hear a robust moral defense of capitalism, which is what we're going to get tonight. I'll keep this short because you didn't come to listen to me. It's my great pleasure to introduce tonight Dr. Yaron Brook, the President and Executive Director of the Ayn Rand Institute in California. He's also the founder, Managing Director and Chairman of BH Equity Research, a financial company. He's a contributor to the Objective Standard and a regular media commentator. I'm getting the signal which says you're all going to turn your mobile phones off, by the way, so that's well reminded. He's also a former finance professor, and so I think is perhaps even more qualified than you might imagine to tell us about the situation we're in and how you defend free markets at this juncture. So, Yaron, over to you.
Thank you, Tom. Appreciate it. Thank you all for coming. It's a real pleasure to be here and a real honor to be speaking. Really, my first speaking engagement in London, public speaking engagement in London, it's a real honor to be under the auspices of the Anna Smith Institute. So thank you for inviting me. There are still seats up front, and I promise I don't bite. So feel free to. I think you'll be more comfortable seated. These are very difficult times to be defenders of capitalism, to be defenders of free markets. I get asked all the time, Yaron, how can you continue to defend free markets? How can you continue to defend capitalism given everything that's happened? Hasn't what's happened over the last 18 months proof that capitalism and free markets do not work? And I look at them and I say, what are you talking about? What free markets? What capitalism? Where do you see free markets and capitalism that have failed? Because if we understand free capitalism to mean, or free markets and capitalism to mean, no government intervention in the economy. If we understand capitalism to mean a system of government where the government serves to protect and defend individual rights, to defend us against force and against fraud, but basically leaves us as individuals to contract and negotiate and transact voluntarily with one another, then where is this capitalism that was practiced and then failed? Because that's what capitalism means, and I think one of the most important things those of us who defend capitalism need to do is clearly define our terms. We didn't have capitalism 18 months ago. We didn't have free markets 18 months ago. We had elements of freedom, we had elements of capitalism, but we had lots of elements of state intervention in those markets. Heavy elements of state intervention. So first, we need to define our terms. Capitalism has not failed. Something failed, but it didn't capitalism. What failed is the mixture that we have. The mixture of the regulatory state, the mixture of socialism and capitalism, the mixed economy has indeed failed. And to those of us defending capitalism, that is not a surprise at all. So I think the first thing we have to do is protect our terms, protect our definitions, protect what it is that we mean by capitalism. And let's look at what actually failed. What actually caused this financial crisis? Is it the element of capitalism, the element of freedom, the little bit of freedom that exists in the financial and generally in the markets that has destroyed our economy? Or is it the mixture of regulation and the mixture of state intervention that has caused this crisis? And I think when one looks at the actual facts, the sequence of events that have led to the crisis that we face today, it becomes quite evident, quite obvious indeed, that what has led to the crisis we face today is government intervention. Primarily, I would argue, the role that the central banks have played. Of course, the very existence, in my view, I take a radical position here, the very existence of a central bank is evidence we don't have capitalism. I mean, a bank that sets interest rates for all of us. Interest rates are a pretty complicated price to set. In the Soviet Union, they tried to set the price of bread, right? And they always got it wrong. It was either too high, and what happens when it's too high? You get get too much of something. Or, more common, they set the price too low. And then what happens? You get too little of it, and you have those lines outside, right, for people trying to get the bread because there was so little of it, and prices don't adjust, supply and demand never match. So a bunch of bureaucrats in the Soviet Union sat around a table and figured, what should be the price of bread today? And they got that wrong. And bread is a relatively simple commodity. It's a relatively simple product. Interest rates are far more complicated than bread. And yet, in the United States, we trust 12 members of the Federal Reserve to sit around a table and decide, what should interest rates be today? And surprise, surprise, they get it wrong almost every time. And if you want the source of this current crisis, I would take you back to 2003, when, in their wisdom, the Federal Reserve in the United States, and I know less about what the Bank of England was doing, but I suspect something very similar. The Federal Reserve, in their wisdom, lowered interest rates to 1%. When inflation, there's a Fed funds rate, the rate at which banks borrow and lend from one another, where inflation was at 3-4%. So the rate of interest was negative. The real rate of interest was negative. Now, what happens when a rate of interest is negative? Everybody borrows money. You're stupid if you don't. They're paying you to borrow money. They're begging you to borrow money. So everybody borrows money. And indeed, if you look at the increase in credit coming out of 2003, all the way through 2005, 2006, it goes through the roof. People are borrowing money to buy homes. People are borrowing money on their credit cards. Corporations were borrowing money. Everybody was leveraging. The investment banks went from 12 to 1 leverage to 40 to 1 leverage. Why not when money is almost free? And if this crisis is about anything, this crisis is fundamentally about too much leverage, too much debt, too much credit. And when you borrow that credit at basically 1, 2, 3%, and then suddenly the Federal Reserve jacks interest rates up, right? They underprice it, and then they overprice it, up to 5.25% in the steepest increase of interest rates in, I think, U.S. history, from 2000, starting 2005 to 2006. Then suddenly something you could afford when interest rates were 1%, you can't afford anymore when interest rates are 5.25%. Suddenly people start defaulting on their mortgages and on their other debt. So this crisis, without any question, is a classical Austrian economics, Hayek and von Mises and economists like that would have predicted this case of bad monetary policy. Not that there's necessarily anything, any such thing as good monetary policy. I'm not a big believer in monetary policy, but this is clearly a case of awful monetary policy.